All right, that's enough. Hey! That's enough. That's enough. Okay, thank you. That's enough. Do you have freedom? In essence, are you allowed to be you? Do you have the quality or state of being free? The power to do as one pleases, freedom from physical restraint, freedom from arbitrary or despotic control, the power of choice? Are you sovereign? That is the liberty mindset. Let us foster our curiosity and seek the truth. Well, welcome everybody. It is Wednesday at 1300 Pacific Daylight Time, Standard Time, for another little while anyway. Chapter 5 of Planned Chaos by Ludwig von Mises. We're going to be reading that, and then if there's anybody up for discussion, we will discuss. Chapter 5, Trotsky's Heresy. The dictatorial doctrine as taught by the Russian Bolshevists, the Italian fascists, and German Nazis tacitly implies that there cannot arise any disagreement with regard to the question of who shall be the dictator. The mystical forces directing the course of historical events designate the providential leader. All righteous people are bound to submit to the unfathomable decrees of history and bend their knees before the throne of the man of destiny. Those who decline to do so are heretics, abject scoundrels, and must be, quote, liquidated. In reality, the dictatorial power is seized by the candidate who succeeds in exterminating in time all of his rivals and their helpers. The dictator paves his way to the supreme power by slaughtering all of his competitors. He preserves his eminent position by butchering all those who could possibly dispute it. The history of all Oriental despotism bears witness to this, as well as the experience of contemporary dictatorship. When Lenin died in 1924, Stalin supplanted his most dangerous rival, Trotsky. Trotsky escaped, spent years abroad, various countries of Europe, Asia, and America, and was finally assassinated in Mexico City. Stalin remained the absolute ruler of Russia. Trotsky was an intellectual of the orthodox Marxian type. As much as he tried to present his personal feud with Stalin as a conflict of principles, he tried to construct a Trotsky doctrine as distinguished from the Stalin doctrine. He branded Stalin's policy as an apostasy from the sacred legacy of Marx and Lenin. Stalin retorted in the same way. In fact, however, the conflict was a rivalry of two men, not a conflict of antagonistic ideas, principles. There was some minor dissent with regard to tactical methods, but in all essential matters, Stalin and Trotsky were in agreement. Trotsky had lived before 1917 many years in foreign countries and was to some degree familiar with the main languages of the Western peoples. He posed as an expert in international affairs. Actually, he did not know anything about Western civilization, political ideas, and economic conditions. As a wandering exile, he had moved almost exclusively in the circles of his fellow exiles. The only foreigners whom he had met occasionally in coffee houses and club rooms of Western and Central Europe were radical doctrinaires. By their Marxian prepositions, their Marxian prepositions precluded some reality. Sorry guys. Real words. By their Marxian prepositions precluded from reality. This main reading was Marxian books. His main reading was Marxian books and periodicals. Periodicals. We don't use those anymore because everything's on the web. Marxian books and periodicals. He scorned all other writings as bourgeois literature. He was absolutely unfitted to see his events from any other angle than that of Marxism. Like Marx, he was ready to interpret every great strike and every small riot as a sign of the outbreak of the final Great Revolution. Stalin is a poorly educated Georgian. He has not the slightest knowledge of any Western language. He does not know Europe or America. Even his achievements as a Marxian author are questionable. But it was precisely the fact that, although an adamant supporter of communism, he was not indoctrinated with Marxian dogmas that made him superior to Trotsky. Stalin was not deluded by the spurious tenets of dialectical materialism. When he faced with a problem, he did not search for an interpretation in the writings of Marx and Engels. He trusted his common sense. He was judicious enough to discern the fact that the policy of world revolution, as inaugurated by Lenin and Trotsky in 1917, had failed completely outside the borders of Russia. In Germany, the communists led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were crushed by detachments of the regular army and the nationalist volunteers in bloody battle fought in January 1919 in the streets of Berlin. The communist seizure of power in Munich in the spring of 1919 and the Holz riot in March 1921 ended likewise in disaster. In Hungary in 1919, the communists were defeated by Horthy and Goebbels and the Romanian army. In Austria, various communist plots failed in 1918 and 1919. A violent upheaval in July of 1927 was easily quelled by the Vienna police. In Italy, in 1920, the occupation of the factories was a complete miscarriage. In France and in Switzerland, the communist propaganda seemed to be very powerful in the first years following the armistice of 1918, but evaporated very soon. In Great Britain in 1926, the general strike called for by the labor unions resulted in lamentable failure. Trotsky was so blinded by his orthodoxy that he refused to admit that the Bolshevists' methods had failed. But Stalin realized it very well. He did not abandon the idea of instigating revolutionary outbreaks in all foreign countries and of conquering the whole world for the Soviets, but he was fully aware that the fact that it was necessary to postpone his aggression for a few years and to resort to new methods for its execution. Trotsky was wrong in accusing Stalin of strangling the communist movement outside of Russia. What Stalin really did was to apply other means for the attainment of ends which are common to him and all other Marxians. As an energetic of Marxian dogma, Stalin was certainly inferior to Trotsky, but he surpassed his rival by far as a politician. Bolshevism owns its success in the world policies to Stalin, not to Trotsky. In the field of domestic policies, Trotsky resorted to the well-tried traditional tricks which Marxians had always applied in criticizing social measures adopted by other parties. Whatever Stalin did was not true socialism and communism, but, on the contrary, the very opposite of it, a monstrous perversion of lofty principles of Marx and Lenin. All the disastrous features of public control of production and the distribution as they appeared in Russia were in Trotsky's interpretation brought about by Stalin's policies. They were not unavoidable consequences of the communist methods. They were attendant phenomenon of Stalinism and not of communism. It was exclusively Stalin's fault that an absolutist, irresponsible bureaucracy was supreme, that a class of privileged oligarchs enjoyed luxuries while the masses lived in the verge of starvation, that a terrorist regime executed the old guard of revolutionaries and condemned millions to slave labor in concentration camps, that the secret police was omnipotent, that the labor unions were powerless, that the masses were deprived of all rights and liberties, Stalin was not a champion of the egalitarian classes society. Stalin was not a champion of the egalitarian classless society. He was a pioneer of a return to the worst methods of class rule and exploitation. A new ruling class of about 10% of the population ruthlessly oppressed and exploited the immense majority of toiling proletarians. Trotsky was at loss to explain how all this could be achieved by only one man and his few sycophants. Where were the, quote, material production forces, end quote, much talked about in Marxian historical materialism, which, independent of the will of the individuals, determine the course of human events, with the inexorability of law of nature? How could it happen that one man was in a position to alter the judicial and political superstructure, which is uniquely and inalterably fixed by the economic structure of society? Even Trotsky agreed that there was no longer any private ownership of the means of production in Russia. In Stalin's empire, production and distribution are eventually controlled by, quote, society, end quote. This is a fundamental dogma of Marxism, that the superstructure of such a system must necessarily be the bliss of the earthly paradise. There is in Marxian doctrines no room for an interpretation blaming individuals for a degenerative process that would convert the blessings of public control of business into evil. A consistent Marxist, if consistency were compatible with Marxism, would have to admit that Stalin's political system was the necessary superstructure of communism. All essential items in Trotsky's program were in perfect agreement with the policies of Stalin. Trotsky had advocated the industrialization of Russia. It was this that Stalin's 5-year plans aimed at. Trotsky advocated for the collectivization of agriculture. Stalin established the kobuls and liquidated the kolukas, and Trotsky favored the origination of a big army. Stalin organized such an army. Neither was Trotsky, when he still in power, a friend of democracy. He was, on the contrary, a fanatical supporter of dictatorial oppression by all saboteurs. It is true he did not anticipate that the dictator would consider him, Trotsky, author of Marxism tracts and veteran of the glorious extermination of the Romanovs, as the most wicked saboteur. Like all other advocates of dictatorship, he assumed that he himself, or one of his intimate friends, would be the dictator. Sucks not to be in charge. Trotsky was a critic of bureaucratism, but he did not suggest any other method for the conduct of affairs in the socialist system. There is no other alternative to profit-seeking, profit business than bureaucratic management. The truth is that Trotsky found only one fault with Stalin, that he, Stalin, was the dictator and not himself, Trotsky. In their feud, they both were right. Stalin was right in maintaining that his regime was the embodiment of socialist principles. Trotsky was right in asserting that Stalin's regime had made Russia a hell. Trotsky did not entirely disappear with Trotsky's death. Boulangerism in France, too, survived for some time in the end of the General Boulanger. There were still Carlists left in Spain, although the line of Don Carlos died out. Such posthumous movements are, of course, doomed. But in all countries, there are people who, although themselves fanatically committed to the idea of all-around planning, i.e. public ownership and the means of production, become frightened when they are confronted with the real face of communism. These people are disappointed. They dream of a Garden of Eden. For them, communism or socialism means an easy life and riches and the full enjoyment of liberties and pleasures. They fail to realize the contradictions inherent in their image of the communist society. They have uncritically swallowed all the lunatic fantasies of Charles Fourier and all the absurdities of Veblen. They firmly believe in Engels' assertion that socialism will be a realm of unlimited freedom. They indict capitalism for everything they dislike and are fully convinced that socialism will deliver them from all evil. They ascribe their own failures and frustrations to the unfairness of this, quote, mad, unquote, competitive system and expect that socialism will assign them that eminent position and high income which they have a right to due to them. They are Cinderella's yearning for the Prince Savior who will recognize their merits and virtues. Their The loathing of capitalism and the worship of communism are consolidation, or bad choice to read today. The loathing of capitalism and the worship of communism are consolations for them. They help them to disguise themselves their own inferiority and to blame the system for their own shortcomings. In advocation of dictatorship, such people always advocate the dictatorship of their own clique. In asking for planning, what they have in mind is always their own plan, not that of others. They will never admit that a socialist or a communist regime is true and genuine, socialism or communism. It is not it is not asinine to, if it is not assigned to themselves the most eminent position and the highest income, for them the essential feature of true and genuine communism is that all affairs are precisely conducted according to their own will, and that all those who disagree are beaten into submission. It is a fact that the majority of our contemporaries are imbued with socialist and communist ideas. However, this does not mean that they are unanimously in their proposals for socialization of the means of production and public control of production and distribution. On the contrary, each socialist courtier is financially opposed to the plans of all other socialist groups. The various socialist sects fight one another most bitterly. If the case of Trotsky and the analogous case of George Strasser in Nazi Germany was isolated cases, there would be no need to deal with them. But they are not casual incidents. They are typical. Study of them reveals the psychology causes both of the... Study of them reveals the psychological causes both of the popularity of socialism and its unfeasibility. Well then, that was chapter 5. Interesting observations. I found it fascinating how much of that resonates today in what's going on, and how much it's not, I don't even know, does history repeat itself, or does it just keep trying the same things over and over again, not so much repetitively, but continually? What is the right answer there? Currently, we have a bunch of people in our current administration that reward or think we should be more like China, with total control over our economics. And yet, I don't know, has that worked anywhere? It's fascinating how Stalin, in getting to the point where he was chief administrator and had total control over the Russian system, how he ended up exercising capitalism by trying to, by allowing the production of and stuff to be all determined by the people until much later, until he had his organization built. It's a fascinating history, the Soviet Union, how things changed and how they changed names of places and brought down statues and all the things we're doing today. History is important. Even bad history is something to be remembered and to be studied. If we don't study our history, then how do we not grow? Yeah. 1917 was tremendous in Russia. There was influence from all over the world to make that happen. Lenin was sent by train from Austria to take part in the revolution, and him and Trotsky managed to do all kinds of nasty things, Stalin coming up later. I just see so many parallels in philosophy, what the Trotskys and the Stalinists trying to do to what is going on right now. It's really frightening. Anyway, the chapter is yours. they should be like Sweden. Well, Sweden, the number of people that immigrate to the United States from Sweden, it might be an indication why you don't want to live in Sweden. I know a lot of people call for Norway, and that's from Jimmy Time in the comments. People tell me, well, in Scandinavia they do this. Well, in Scandinavia they don't do anything like we do, and that's something to be considered. Let's, for example, one place I know about. If I want to move to Norway, to emigrate to Norway, I have to have a job sewn up before I show up, or enough money to keep myself supplied through other means. I can immigrate there for 5 years, but at the end of that 5 years, I have to have a linguist test, and I have to be proficient in Norwegian, because that is their national language. It is required. It's part of what you do to become a Norwegian citizen. And there are some benefits and things, because Norway has its own don't want to say semi-socialist, but they have a lot of government interaction with the people, and it's in some ways oppressive, especially when it comes to taxes and things like that, just because of all the social programs. And that's with their oil production that is supposedly shared by everybody, but the government manages to spend more than it gets from the oil production, because the oil production in Norway is actually completely controlled and more or less owned by the government, and the idea is you get a free education and a few other things from that money. Which is why it takes so long to get into Norway. You have to prove that you're going to be there for a long time. Where here, people are coming across the border, walking across the border in their flip-flops with no money, paying thousands of dollars to come in here, to people to illegally bring them in here. Does our system need to be fixed? Absolutely. Personally, I'm welcoming to anybody that wants to come to this country, become an American, and work hard. There's nothing wrong with that. That is absolutely what we are founded on. I do have a little bit of challenge with people that have to come, and in some cases have to come here. I acknowledge that. But then they turn around and have to send all their money elsewhere. And because that doesn't help this country at all, having all of their labors exported. A person should be able to come here and enjoy the fruits of their labors. That is the principles we were founded on. And Jimmy, in response to your question about not needing a job and not needing income there's a difference between emigrate and crossing the border. And please acknowledge that we have no barriers on our even our northern borders. We have few barriers. The Canadians are a bigger barrier on the northern border than we are. But on our southern border, anybody from anywhere can come across. There's no, if they catch half of them, which is to me a little bit high on the estimate, even if they catch half of them, they're told to show up at court and then never have to, and never do. So there's a difference between emigrating and coming in illegally. Norway doesn't have an illegal alien problem that we do, because they don't let it happen. If I have no callers, I'm going to, and in America, by the way, you don't have to learn a language anymore. You used to, but you don't have to learn a language anymore. You can come here, which to me, it's based on a spurless argument that freedom of speech is protected, therefore you don't have to learn the language. And I think there has to be a certain amount of principle and homogeny in a society for it to function. And that's what the libtards do, is tell you that everybody's free to do whatever they want, and they can be whatever they want, and therefore then you end up with the homeless crisis. You end up with the parts of town that are specifically, quote, insert nationality here, Hispanic, Armenian, whatever, depending on what town you're in and where people are coming from. You end up with these almost ghetto-like situations where everybody's there and they could grow up never having to learn any other language but their native tongue, which is great that they have a native tongue. But in order to participate in society, you really need to be able to communicate with others. And in order to get in here, you do have to have it. In order to get in here legally and through the system, sure, you have to have some form of proof of income and a reason to come in, like a job or whatever. And is that bad? It's all the illegal stuff that is causing much of the problem, where our fentanyl and all the other things come across the border with them. Anyway, well, guys, it was actually a fairly short read today. I thought it was going to take longer than that. But if I have no callers, poorest states in the USA are Republican. I'm not sure about that statistic. It'd be interesting to see, something about that. I can't tell you one way or the other whether that's true. And define poor. There may be. I used to live in a third world country, Lesotho, and that country was poor, and I didn't make very much money, but I lived like a king. In this country, we don't have poor. I'm sorry, but when you can get your free cell phone from the government and you can have, the biggest complaint is that you can't afford your HBO, that's not poor. Also, oh, that's my dog joining in the conversation. Okay, she's done, I think. Most of the states that are economically growing the fastest are what people call the red states, Florida, Texas, etc. That's where everybody is leaving everywhere else and moving to because the opportunities are better there. Now, they may not yet be the richest states, but based on immigration between the states, based on all the Californians going to Texas and Arizona, and based on all the New Yorkers going to Florida and Georgia, I would have to say you're going to find out that that's a challenge. I'm just saying the definition of poor. Even folks who are homeless have cell phones here. And, some places would consider them quite well off. Poor is all in your definition. Even the poorest in this country actually have much better situations than most of the rest of the world. Most of the even homeless in this country would actually be in the top 15 or 20% of income earners on the planet. So it's all relative to where you're at. And sure, they can't afford their houses because the housing is too expensive for lots of reasons. My comment was not that we don't have poor. We have what we call poor. I'm just saying that our definition of poor is very different than what you will find in Venezuela, Venezuela is probably even similar to ours. Actually, economically they have, they're both Argentina, Venezuela. Brazil, for example, has a very large disparity between the rich and the poor. If you're poor in Brazil, you're pretty poor. If you're poor in Africa, most of the continent, there's no point in having a cell phone because there's no service. Unless you're in the cities there. And as soon as you get out of the cities, there's no service. So here we have, almost nationwide service everywhere you can go. So yeah, we have poor, but I'm just saying in some places on this planet, what if they were to have the incomes they have, they would be well off. Even what we call homeless generally have some sort of aid coming into them. They have some sort of money, and even the ones that beg on the streets. There was an interesting article. There was an interview done by a person who was quote homeless in San Diego when I was living there. This was 10 years ago, And everybody knew this person because it was they set up their begging spot in a very popular place. And the news media surreptitiously followed them one time. And this guy came out there in his little, torn up folding chair and sat out there with his sign begging for money and got this, that, and the other thing. And when they followed him, he had almost a brand new SUV that he drove to his nice house. So you can't always judge a book by its cover because, and I'll admit that's probably the exception to the rule, but you can't judge you just can't judge a book by a cover. And the homeless population here, how much of it is income and how much of it is mental illness? A vast, though that may not be the case now, before COVID, homelessness was really, probably more a mental illness issue than anything else. And I'll admit that there have been some people that have been made homeless by work situations and such, and that needs to be resolved. But as long as we keep restricting economic growth the way we are with our current laws and stuff, we're going to find it hard to get people back to work. Of course, that's probably why they want to go to war in Ukraine and China. So, because, that's always good for the economy. All right, my friend, and the rest of the world, thank you for coming. This will be posted on Spotify and all major podcasts in the not too distant future. And please remember to stay curious and seek the truth.
Thank you for joining us at the Liberty Mindset. Freedom is a state of being, and liberty is a state of mind. So stay curious and seek the truth.